Despite her cheating fiancé, she wed a blind stranger, unaware he was the ruthless war duke. Most love stories begin with a first kiss. Aurelia Sterling's began with a betrayal. 2 days before her wedding, she caught her fiancé in the arms of her closest friend. Heartbroken and furious, she did the unthinkable, kissed a blind beggar on a crowded street, and asked him to marry her. It was meant to be an act of spite. She never expected the beggar to say yes, and she certainly never expected him to be the ruthless war duke hidden behind a silk blindfold. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden beauty and unexpected love, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories where pain shatters and true character shines through. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and your presence makes these stories come alive. The lavender was fresh that morning. Lady Aurelia Sterling had cute herself from the garden before dawn, bundling the purple stems with a ribbon the same shade as her wedding dress, which hung upstairs, waiting for the day after tomorrow. She had wanted everything to be perfect. She had planned everything to be perfect. She was not prepared for the sound of laughter behind St. Jude's churchyard wall. It was not just any laughter. It was the low, pleased kind, the sort that belonged in a private room with the curtains drawn, not in a churchyard 2 days before a wedding. Aurelia slowed her steps on the gravel path. The basket of lavender swung from her wrist. She told herself it was probably children playing among the old graves, or perhaps the groundskeeper telling stories to his dog. She peered around the corner of the stone wall. Lord Edmund Hargrove, the Earl of Berkshire, her fiancé of 4 months, was pressed against the moss-covered stone of the Whitfield family crypt with his arms around Miss Letticia Horne, Aurelia's closest friend since childhood, the woman who had helped choose her French lace veil, the woman who had embraced her at the engagement party and whispered, "You deserve every happiness." And he was kissing her with an enthusiasm that left absolutely no ambiguity about the nature of the activity. Aurelia stood very still for 3 full seconds. Then her silk slipper found a dry twig. Crunch! The sound split the morning air like a gunshot. The two figures sprang apart. Berkshire turned, and the blood drained from his face so completely that he looked like one of the marble angels behind him. Letticia had the grace to look at the ground, though she ruined the effect by adjusting her hair. "Aurelia," Berkshire said. Then, collecting himself with the confidence of a man who had talked his way out of trouble before, he added, "This is not what it appears." Aurelia looked at her basket of lavender. She looked at the crypt. She looked at Letitia's wrinkled collar. Then she turned and walked away down the gravel path at a pace that forced Berkshire to jog to keep up. "My dove, listen to me." It was a momentary possession by the devil, nothing more. He reached for her arm. She stepped sideways without breaking stride. "Men have needs, Aurelia. It means nothing. Letter means absolutely nothing. You are to be my countess, which is an entirely different matter." Aurelia pushed through the iron gate and stepped onto the cobblestone road. The morning sun was sharp. Carts rumbled past. A flower seller was shouting prices from a barrow. The whole world continued as though it had not just shattered itself into pieces. She stopped walking. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely certain she was not going to cry. Not because she was not hurt, because she was in a hot and furious way that sat behind her ribs like a lit coal, but because crying would require Berkshire to comfort her, and if he touched her right now, she would say something so unladylike that St. Jude himself might cover his ears. What she needed was a way to make him stop following her. She looked up. Leaning against a stone hitching post not 10 feet away was a man who had no business being as handsome as he was given the state of his clothing. His coat was tattered at the elbows and stiff with dried mud. His boots were cracked along the sides. A silver begging plate sat balanced on his knee, catching the sun. He held a polished oak cane across his lap, which seemed oddly fine for a beggar, and he wore a thick black silk blindfold tied smoothly over his eyes. Despite all of it, his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. His dark hair fell slightly across his forehead. His shoulders stretched his ruined coat to its very limits. Berkshire was still talking behind her. Something about the wedding, about her pride, about how she would regret this moment of temper. Aurelia's mind made a decision before she had finished making it. She crossed the distance in 4 steps, grabbed the beggar by his lapels, and kissed him. He froze entirely. She felt the startled tension in him, the absolute stillness of a man caught completely off guard. She kept the kiss firm and unmistakable, the kind that left no room for confusion, and then she stepped back. The beggar said nothing for a moment. Then a slow smile spread across his face, unhurried and deeply amused, as if the morning had just become considerably more interesting. Behind her, Berkshire made a strangled sound. Aurelia did not look at him. She looked at the beggar, at the fine line of his jaw, at the blindfold, at the silver plate, and the terrible idea she'd been forming in the space of 10 seconds solidified into something that felt absurdly like a plan. "It is an absolute tragedy," she said, keeping her voice steady, "that someone with a face as pretty as yours must spend his youth begging on the streets. Sir, my groom is a treacherous hound. My wedding is in 2 days, and I have an empty altar." She paused. "Marry me, and I shall ensure you never hold a begging plate again. What say you?" There was a silence. The flower seller's shouting filled it. A carter sneezed. The beggar tilted his head slightly, tapping the cane against his boot. Then he chuckled. It was a deep, rich sound, the kind that came from somewhere unhurried, and it sent something strange and inconvenient down the length of Aurelia's spine. "A roof over my head," he said slowly, "and a fiery wife who kisses like a tempest." He tilted his face toward her, and though she could not see his eyes behind the blindfold, she had the distinct and unsettling feeling that he was looking at her very carefully. "Madam, I am entirely at your service." Berkshire behind her found his voice. "Aurelia, you cannot be serious." "I am always serious," she said, and held out her hand to the beggar. He found it without hesitation. By the following morning, London had opinions. The broadsheets had somehow gotten hold of the story before Aurelia had finished her breakfast tea, which suggested either a very fast printer or a very loud cobblestone road. The headlines ranged from stunned to gleeful beautiful noble lady to wed blind street beggar out of spite. One declared with an enthusiasm that suggested the editor had been waiting his whole career for a story like this. Aurelia read it at the breakfast table, drank the rest of her tea, and went to file the marriage license. She had learned the beggar's name over a very awkward supper the evening before, conducted in her sitting room with the housekeeper present as chaperone, and a great deal of careful conversation. He had told her calmly and without much additional detail that his name was Benedict, just Benedict. He had offered nothing further, and she had not pressed, mostly because she had a suspicion that if she asked too many questions she might talk herself out of the whole arrangement, and she was not ready to do that yet. He was polite. He was quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than uncomfortable. He ate with the ease of a man who had never once been anxious at a table which he found strange, and said thank you to the housekeeper with a warmth that made the older woman look at him twice. Aurelia had decided he was acceptable. She had also decided not to think too hard about the feeling that had gone down her spine in the churchyard. By 11 o'clock, she was back at the Sterling estate, standing in the library doorway with the signed license in her hand. Her father was already there. So was Berkshire. Lord Sterling stood behind the mahogany desk, in the full authority of a man who believed very firmly that things should go the way he expected them to go. He was a large man, red-faced in a permanent way that had nothing to do with exertion, and he was looking at Aurelia with the expression he reserved for problems he intended to solve quickly. Berkshire stood to the left of the desk, looking smug in a way he was trying to disguise as concern. "Aurelia," her father said. His voice was the controlled kind of loud. "Sit down." "I prefer to stand." "Thank you." His jaw tightened. "This nonsense ends today. Whatever display you staged yesterday on the public road was embarrassing, and it is finished. Berkshire has agreed to proceed with the wedding. You will apologize for the scene, and you will be at the altar on Saturday." "I filed the marriage license this morning," Aurelia said for the beggar. "His name is Benedict." The silence that followed was the particular kind that preceded an explosion. Berkshire made a soft, shocked sound. Lord Sterling placed both hands flat on the desk. "A woman," her father said very carefully, "does not make a fuss over a husband's minor indiscretions. That is the nature of marriage. That is the nature of the world. You will not throw away a title, a fortune, and this family's alliance over something so entirely unremarkable." Aurelia looked at him steadily. She had been preparing for this conversation in some form for most of her life. What Berkshire did is not minor, and this family's alliance was built on the assumption that I would be exchanged for it, which I am no longer willing to be. Then you will be exchanged for nothing. Her father's voice dropped into something cold and deliberate. If you go through with this fast, you are stripped of your dowry. You are stripped of your title. You leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back, and you will not be welcome to return. He paused. Think carefully, Aurelia. She thought carefully for approximately 4 seconds. Then she curtsied. It was a very graceful curtsy which she was privately pleased about. Berkshire, she said, turning to him. You deserve Letitia. I mean that in the least flattering way possible. Then she walked out of the library down the hall and through the front door into the sharp morning air with the marriage license folded in her hand and absolutely nothing else. She told herself the tightness in her chest was relief. It might even have been true. The chapel was smaller than she had expected. Aurelia stood at the altar in a simple white day dress, because simple was what she had, holding a small bunch of herbs the housekeeper had pressed into her hands that morning with the solemn air of a woman doing what she could. The pews held a scattered collection of curious observers, mostly neighbors who had read the broadsheets and could not resist, and 1 or 2 of Aurelia's friends who had come out of loyalty and were now clutching each other's arms and whispering. Berkshire was also there. She had spotted him in the back row before the ceremony began, settling in with the smug expectation of a man who had come to watch an embarrassment. She ignored him. She kept her chin up and her hands still and stared at the chapel doors. They creaked open. What walked in was not what she had expected. The man had the same dark hair as Benedict, the same jaw, the same broad shoulders. But he moved like someone who had never in his life been uncertain of where he was going. His posture was the posture of a man who had commanded rooms, armies, and possibly entire territories. He wore a midnight blue military uniform with gold embroidery at the collar and cuffs, every detail precise, every button in place. His Hessian boots struck the stone floor with a clean, deliberate click that echoed through the chapel like a countdown. He still wore the black silk blindfold. On his right was a stoic valet in perfectly pressed livery. On his left was a tall, very handsome man in a colonel's uniform who had the expression of someone trying hard not to find this funny and failing. The chapel had gone completely silent for 1 beat, and then it erupted. The whispers bounced off the stone walls from every direction, overlapping and urgent. Aurelia caught fragments as the man walked toward her. Good God, that's not possible. Is that not? Yes, the uniform. Look at the insignia. That's the War Duke. That's the Duke of Ashbourne, the butcher of the Iberian campaign. A woman 3 rows back made a sound like she had swallowed something unexpected. Berkshire in the back row had gone the precise color of old chalk. The man reached the altar. He was Benedict, the beggar from the hitching post. The man who had taken her hand without hesitation and eaten supper in her sitting room with easy, quiet manners. The man she had kissed on a cobblestone road to wound a faithless earl. The Duke of Ashbourne, the most feared, most powerful, most ruthless man in the British Empire, according to every whisper currently bouncing off the chapel walls. Aurelia leaned close. We must stop this, she breathed, keeping her voice low and urgent. You lied to me. You are a duke. I had no idea what I was asking. I thought you were. I am backing out. The Duke turned the blindfolded face toward her. The smile that appeared was slow and devastating and very slightly wicked. What is this, my sweet deliverer? The voice was quiet, meant only for her, rich with a private amusement she now understood had been there all along. Are you soundly a scaredy cat? Wanting to go back on your word before the whole ton, he tilted his head just slightly. Stand tall, little bird. Marry me and I promise I will make your miserable ex-fiancé regret the very day he was born. Aurelia's eyes went despite herself to the back row. Berkshire was sweating visibly. His smugness had collapsed entirely and been replaced by something much more satisfying. He looked like a man who had arrived at a comedy show and discovered it was his own funeral. Aurelia faced forward. She was not a coward. She had never been a coward. She had walked out of her father's library that morning with nothing in her hand but a marriage license and the knowledge that she meant what she said, and she was not going to let Berkshire watch her lose her nerve at an altar. I am no coward, she said. They said their vows. When it was done, the Duke of Ashbourne Benedict, who had sat against a hitching post in ruined clothes 2 mornings ago with a silver plate on his knee, lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a formal kiss to her knuckles with the serenity of a man who had just gotten exactly what he wanted. The chapel did not know what to do with itself. The vicar looked faintly stunned. The colonel was absolutely not laughing, though the corners of his mouth had given up the fight. In the back row, Berkshire sat completely still in a puddle of his own ruined expectations. Aurelia was a duchess. She had absolutely no idea what to do next. The Duke's mansion was not what Aurelia had imagined. She had braced herself for something cold and severe. All gray stone and silent corridors, the kind of house that suited a man called the Butcher of the Iberian Campaign. Instead, it was sprawling and warm, full of good fireplaces and tall windows, with a library that made her stop in the doorway and take a slow breath of deep, involuntary pleasure. "The library meets with your approval," Benedict said from behind her without the cane, moving through his own house with a fluid certainty that she was already beginning to find suspicious. "It's extraordinary," she said, meaning it entirely. "It is yours," he said, as simply as he might say. "The weather is mild today," and walked on. She stood there for a moment, looking at the shelves, and told herself the warmth in her chest was merely the fire. Life in the Ashbourne mansion settled into a pattern that was, depending on the hour, either deeply amusing or deeply inconvenient. Benedict was an attentive husband in the formal sense, polite and considerate, always present at meals, always steady and unhurried. He listened to her talk, which she had not quite expected, with the focused quality of someone for whom listening was not a passive activity. He never spoke just to fill silence. He never agreed with her simply because it was easier. He also had the most inconvenient habit of finding things, keys she had left on chairs, books she had set down in the wrong rooms, her gloves, which she was forever misplacing. He would produce them at the precise moment she began looking without fuss, without explanation, guided apparently by nothing but his cane and some instinct she could not account for. She began watching him. On the 4th day, she changed her gown in her room while he sat quietly by the fire, or rather while he sat holding a book toward the general direction of the firelight. She had chosen the part of the room deliberately, reasoning that it was further from the fire than she usually stood, and she wished to observe whether he tracked sound or simply memorized the room. She took her time about it. When she looked up from reassigning the last button, Benedict was gazing serenely at the wall, but his jaw was tight in a way that had not been there before she began. She filed this away without comment. At dinner that evening, she waited until his attention appeared to be on his soup, then raised her hand in a slow, deliberate wave, approximately 2 feet from his nose. His hand shot out and caught her wrist. She inhaled. He brought her knuckles to his lips, slow and warm, watching the wall with perfect innocence while her face went hot in a way she absolutely refused to acknowledge out loud. "Something wrong?" he asked. "Testing the candles," she said. "The light is uneven." He said and released her hand. The society ball 3 nights later was a different kind of test. Aurelia had not wanted to attend, but Benedict had suggested it mildly, and she had agreed out of a stubbornness she could not entirely explain, a determination not to hide in the mansion while London made up its mind about her. Colonel Andrew accompanied them, as he usually did, moving at Benedict's left side with the companionable ease of a man who had been doing so for years. Berkshire was there. He had clearly been drinking, and he had clearly decided that this evening was the moment to restore his dignity. He found them near the edge of the dancing, bowed with exaggerated courtesy, and spent 3 minutes making remarks about Aurelia's family, her missing dowry, and the peculiarity of a duke who required a guide. Benedict stood through all of it with the pleasant stillness of a man waiting for something. When Berkshire turned to move away, still performing for the nearby audience he imagined was sympathetic, Benedict extended his cane in a small, thoughtful motion. Berkshire's foot caught it perfectly. He pitched forward, arms wide, and landed face first into a passing footman's towering tray of iced pastries. The tray went up. The pastries went sideways. The audience, which had not been quite as sympathetic as Berkshire imagined, made a collective sound that was half gasp and half delight. Benedict stood with his cane replaced and his expression entirely neutral. Beside him, his best friend, Colonel Andrew, was studying the ceiling. Aurelia pressed her lips together very hard. The evenings were different. The evenings were the part she had not prepared for. After dinner, they would sit by the library fire and they would talk about books first because the library gave them easy ground. Then more about her mother who had died when Aurelia was 12. About the way the Sterling estate had felt after that, large and managed and oddly airless. About what she had expected her life to look like, which was a question she had stopped asking herself somewhere around the age of 17 and was only now haltingly picking back up. Benedict listened to all of it. He told her about the campaign in Iberia, not the parts the broadsheets printed, but the smaller parts, the cold mornings, the unworkable maps, the men whose names he still remembered. He said things plainly and without performance, and she found herself looking at him across the firelight and thinking that whatever she had agreed to in that churchyard road, it had not been what she expected. She still had not asked him directly about the blindfold. She was building up to it. She was almost certain she already knew. The Royal Gala was exactly the kind of event Aurelia had spent most of her adult life navigating. A vast glittering room full of people performing their social positions with great commitment and variable skill. The Duke of Ashbourne was announced at the doors, and the crowd parted in a way that had nothing to do with good manners and everything to do with instinct. People felt Benedict's presence the way they felt a change in weather. Aurelia walked in on his arm in a royal blue elegant gown that Benedict has gifted her the night before. Lord Sterling was across the room, deep in conversation with Berkshire. Both men looked up when the announcement was made. Her father's expression moved through several stages quickly. Barker's moved through fewer, landing on the particular look of a man calculating what drink would make this evening tolerable. The evening went smoothly for an hour. People approached Benedict with the careful deference due to a war hero and the curious study due to a man in a blindfold. Aurelia spoke when she chose to and held her ground when she needed to, and discovered that being introduced as the Duchess of Ashbourne made people's manners improve with a speed she found both useful and somewhat insulting. Then Berkshire had his third drink, which proved to be one too many. He approached them near the center of the room, where the crowd was thick enough to give him an audience, but polished enough to pretend not to be watching. He greeted Benedict with a bow that had just enough mockery in it to be readable. "A fine evening, Your Grace." He let his gaze drop to the blindfold with exaggerated sympathy. "I do hope you are enjoying it in whatever capacity is available to you." Benedict said nothing. Berkshire reached into his coat pocket, produced a gold coin, and let it fall to the floor. It rang clearly on the polished marble. The nearby conversations dimmed. "Terribly clumsy of me," Berkshire said, watching the coin with a smile. "Dropped my wages. Pity. Let's see if you can find it." There was a silence of approximately 2 seconds. Then Benedict bent and picked up the coin, not with the searching, careful movement of a blind man, but with the direct, immediate reach of someone who had seen exactly where it landed. He held it between 2 fingers, turned it once, and then, in a clean, unhurried arc, he tossed it into Berkshire's champagne glass. The splash caught Berkshire across the front of his coat. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, exhaled in a rush. Benedict reached up and untied the black silk blindfold. He let it drop. His eyes were gray, sharp and clear and wholly focused, and they locked onto Berkshire with a steady, even, absolutely unruffled intensity that made the Earl take one involuntary step backward. "My sight returned months ago, Berkshire." The voice was the same one that had said, "I am entirely at your service on a cobblestone road, easy and unhurried," but there was iron underneath it now that the whole room could hear. "But I kept the blindfold because it allowed me to see people's true colors." He tilted his head very slightly, "and what I see now is a boy who is about to be financially ruined." The silence was absolute. Benedict turned slightly, his gaze moving to include Lord Sterling, who had gone very still across the room. "I have spent the past 2 weeks acquiring Berkshire's debt." The voice was level, almost conversational, all of it. The gambling accounts, the outstanding loans, the overdue notes. Additionally, I have bought the mortgages on the Sterling estate, which were, I discovered, more numerous than Lord Sterling has previously acknowledged. He paused. "Berkshire, you will be vacating your London house within the month. Lord Sterling, I would recommend a conversation with your solicitor at your earliest convenience. I will not be forgiving either set of debts. What I will do is ensure completely and publicly that both of you understand the cost of threatening my wife." Berkshire opened his mouth. "I would not," Colonel Andrews said pleasantly. From somewhere to the left. Berkshire closed his mouth. Lord Stirling, for the first time in Aurelia's memory, had nothing to say. He stood in the middle of the gala with his hands at his sides and the understanding settling over him visibly and irreversibly that he had miscalculated. Aurelia looked at her father across the candle-lit room. She waited to feel something sharp and vindicating. She felt something, but it was quieter than she expected, more tired than triumphant. She had not needed him to love her correctly. She had simply needed him to stop treating her like a transaction. He had chosen not to, and now they were here in this ballroom, and the account was settled. She turned away. They left the gala before midnight. The night air hit them on the steps, cold and clean after the close warmth of the room, and Aurelia breathed it in as Benedict handed her up into the carriage. Colonel Andrew made his excuses at the door with the tact of a man who understood when three was a crowd. And then the carriage door closed and they were moving through London streets in the dark, the lamps making shifting patterns on the carriage walls. Aurelia sat across from Benedict for approximately 12 seconds. "You absolute rogue," she said. He looked at her. It was still strange seeing his eyes gray and direct and currently holding a warmth she recognized from the evenings by the library fire now without the blindfold between them. He did not look away. "You saw everything," she said. "The changing in the room, the faces at dinner, all of it, every beautiful inch of you," he said quietly from the very first morning in the churchyard on the road. The corner of his mouth moved. "You grabbed a stranger by his lapels and kissed him to wound an earl." "I was not going to look at the wall." Aurelia pressed her lips together, fighting the smile with every reasonable resource she had. She lost. "You should have told me from the beginning. You should have told me who you were." "I know." He said it without deflection. Simply and directly. The way he said everything. "I intended to. And then you talked at supper about your mother's garden and the way the Stirling estate smelled in November, and I found I was not finished yet. I wanted one more evening of you speaking to me as though I was simply Benedict." "You are simply Benedict." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, something that had perhaps been waiting to shift for several weeks. "Yes," he said. "I rather think I am." Aurelia moved from her seat across the carriage to the seat beside him. The carriage swayed gently on the uneven road. His hand found hers in the dark, and she let it. "You owe me a full accounting," she said. "I was dressed in rags because I lost a bet against Andrew. Dressing in rags like a beggar was the price to pay. Staying with the blindfold, even when I could see, was my idea. Andrew was against it at first, but he got tired of nagging. You're one stubborn man, my love." Benedict laughed. She had heard him chuckle before, that deep and unhurried sound, but this was fuller, more unguarded, and it was, she decided, one of the better sounds she had encountered. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, London moved past in the dark, all lamp-posts and closing shops, and the last of the evening's theater-goers heading home through the cold. Somewhere in the city, Berkshire was standing in a ballroom with champagne on his coat and an account with Benedict's name on it. Somewhere, her father was speaking to his solicitor in his head, rehearsing a very difficult conversation. Here in the carriage, there was just the sway of the wheels and the warmth of his shoulder and the quiet that felt for the first time in as long as she could remember entirely comfortable. "You saved me from a boring life," Benedict said. The voice was low, close to her ear, honest in the uncomplicated way that he was honest about most things. "And I intend to spend the rest of mine making sure you never regret picking up a beggar on the road." Aurelia was quiet for a moment. "You were a very convincing blind beggar," she said. "I want that acknowledged. I practiced the cane work for a full afternoon." "Andrew taught you." Andrew was appalled to be asked, and then got very into it. She laughed and felt him press a kiss to her hair, firm and warm and unhurried, the way he did everything. Outside, London carried on. The carriage rolled toward Ashbourne House, and Lady Aurelia Stirling, who was no longer Lady Aurelia Stirling, but the Duchess of Ashbourne, who had lost a dowry and a title and a father who had not deserved the name, and had walked out of a library with nothing in her hand but a marriage license and her own considerable nerve, settled into the shoulder of a man who had worn a blindfold to see her clearly and decided that spite, on occasion, was the finest foundation a marriage had ever had.